Right, okay. So, good afternoon, everybody. I'm chairing this afternoon's meeting of Workers International Network. Big welcome to everybody. People from various parts of the world here, which is fantastic, exactly what it's about. Just before we start, can I just ask everybody to keep themselves on mute unless they're actually speaking? And when you've spoken, if you can just mute yourself afterwards, and that cuts down any sort of background noise that's going on in anybody's house. So the subject to this week's meeting is the laws of capitalist crisis. Since the Industrial Revolution, capitalism has dominated the world economy. And as it's proved over the years, it's totally incapable of providing any sort of decent, sustained and secure standard of living for working class people. We find that in the current movement, a lot of socialists think you can reform the capitalist system. But as Marxists, it's our role to not just understand it, but also to explain it and explain how it can be changed. So when he's going to lead off a discussion on the laws of capitalist crisis. And then after that, I'll ask comrades to come in and make contributions. So how long would you like, Ed, to do your lead off?
Well, please, could you give me some sort of note every 5 minutes, and I'll try and keep it to about 20 minutes.
Right, okay, I'll do that. Okay, right,
thank you.
Away.
Sorry. Okay. As Pam said in introducing this, this is a very important question because capitalism has been unable to provide stability and improve the lives of millions of people throughout the planet. And yet every time capitalist economists are asked to account for the failures of their system, they always point to sort of ephemeral reasons why things have gone wrong in the capitalist system. The 2008 financial crash was attributed to the irresponsibility of banks lending money to people who couldn't afford to pay it back. And of course, that's true. Each capitalist crisis has its own particular unique features that are special and have got something to do with morality and the false workings of certain capitalists. But what they miss out is that there are underlying trends, laws of motion in the capitalist system that drive each particular capitalist crisis. And these are recurrent crises that have been with capitalism since its inception in the 18th century. Every few years, the economy goes into a major downturn, and you can't, if you have regular occurrences like that, you can't attribute each occurrence to some accidental feature. You have to, as Marx attempted to do very, very successfully in his life's work, you have to analyze why the system operates with these fluctuations, with these economic fluctuations, and therefore better understand how it's possible to create a system where these economic malpractices can be put an end to and can be replaced by something else. When Britain's top bankers were asked to talk to the House of Commons Select Committee on what went wrong in the 2008 financial crash, they said it was a financial tsunami that came out of nowhere, a 1 in a million chance. No one could have predicted it. But actually, as a matter of fact, there were Marxist economists who did predict it. One of them has been on this show, on the WIN meeting, Michael Roberts. He produced this book, which shows very well that through his analysis of the capitalist system prior to the financial crash of 2008, there were already sound reasons to predict that capitalism would go into that kind of crash. Now, of course, such a grasp of the capitalist economy is based on a thorough analysis. Marx started this analysis. He by no means has the last word on it. There are many additions and new factors, but Marx started analyzing the economy of capitalism with the idea that value is created by human labor, that you have all kinds of resources to be found in the world, raw materials, minerals, and so on. But it's only when labor extracts them and then modifies them and transforms them into commodities that they become items of value. And within that idea is the idea that it's human labor that creates value. Now, in earlier systems of exploitation, it's easy to see where exploitation comes from. In the feudal system, a serf might have easily worked, say, 3 days a week on his own plot of land and 3 days a week on the lord of the manor's plot of the land. And it's absolutely clear as day to see that he's being ripped off, that he's being exploited, because half the work he's doing is for someone else. Under capitalism, in a wage economy, exploitation is there, but it's more hidden, it's more disguised. Marx explained that when the capitalist pays his worker, he's paying his worker enough to keep that worker alive so that he's fit to return to work the next day. In other
5
words,
minutes said.
Thank you. It pays for his food, it pays for his clothing, a roof over his head, and so on. It just about pays if circumstances are okay. But the capitalist puts the worker to work for as long as he can force him to work. It may be 12 hours, 14 hours, 16 hours, partly depending on the strength of trade unions and so on. So the worker may very well cover the cost of his own work, the cost of what it takes him to be there, the cost of his wages. He may cover that in half a day's work. And the remaining half day of his work will actually be surplus value that is appropriated by his capitalist boss, by his employer. That's the basis of exploitation. Of course, the amount that he's exploited will vary depending upon conditions in the economy, the demand for labor, the strength of the trade unions, and so on, how militant the trade unions are. But nevertheless, the work that he does can be divided up into work that can be accounted for by the wage that he receives, and then surplus value, work that he does that is additional, and it becomes part of the profit system that the capitalist expropriates from him. Now, Marx used that as a way of illustrating that the beginning of understanding the capitalist system is exploitation. But through the process of exploitation, of course, profits are made. And if profits are made, everyone with capital floods in to try and get a share of those profits. And capitalism is unplanned. So the first account that Marx gives of why capitalism goes into crisis can be found in this book, Volume 1 of Capital, where he explains that as profits rise, more and more capitalists get into that area of the market. They seek to get hold of the equipment, the machinery, and so on that is producing whatever goods they are that are making the profit. It's unplanned. They all flood in. They start getting more and more workers involved in producing these products, whatever is making a profit. And eventually, because it's unplanned, they are making too many of these products. The market becomes glutted, prices fall, even the price of the machinery that they're using to produce these products begins to fall because nobody can make use of it. And you have a recession. Workers are laid off, workers are made unemployed, and capitalists can no longer make a profit for a while. And at the bottom of a recession, when prices have fallen so much that the machinery and the raw materials and so on become very, very cheap, then capitalists, quite often innovative capitalists who are inventing better methods, new methods of technology, come in with new forms of production, taking advantage of the cheap conditions that there are for labor and raw materials, and they start producing new products in a new way, and you get a new boom. And that in its essence is Karl Marx's account for these regular crises of overproduction that come about in the capitalist economy. And I'll give you just one statistic to illustrate this. In the current economy, there are about 70 million cars produced every year globally in the world at the moment. The capacity for car production annually is 139 million. So it's almost the capacity for car production. In other words, the amount of plant and machinery and raw material that is available is almost double the size that the car market can absorb. That's a formula for overproduction, and it's bound to threaten this system with insecurity and cyclical movements of when you can make a profit. Now, Marx is well known for the statement, capitalism digs its own grave. The capitalist digs his own grave. Each capitalist is compelled by the drive for profit to do something that brings about profit in the short term, to expand production. And we have to acknowledge that capitalism has been very inventive. It's produced science and technology, and it's raised humanity from the level of feudal existence to the threshold now where we're on the point with science and technology. We're at the point where we can have a world where nobody has to work, and yet everyone has enough.
10 minutes said.
Capitalism has advanced enormously, but it's the short-term interests of capitalists conflict with the long-term good of the system as a whole. And this particularly comes up in a development that Marx analyzes in volume 3 of Capital, which is the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. Marx, as I've already pointed out, Marx explains that profit is derived from the labor of the working class. As society becomes more technological, as the economy becomes more advanced and based on invention of machines, the proportion of investment that goes into technology increases in comparison to the amount of investment that goes into employing workers. So over the lifetime of capitalism, a bigger and bigger proportion of investment goes into an area of capital where profit cannot be made, because profit is only made from the labor of the working class. And so progressively, throughout the life of capitalism, there's a tendency for the rate of profit to fall. So if you have this cyclical character with overproduction, producing a collapse in the economy every few years, and a long-term trend with the rate of profit falling, we can be sure that we're in a system that hasn't got a future. We're in a system that is actually working towards its own endpoint. I mean, you don't need to be very imaginative to, you think about shipbuilding. I mean, 200 years ago, people would have been carrying heavy duty stuff around in a shipyard, and that would have been 20, 30, even 100 laborers, whereas now that work would be done by an automatic crane. And so the organic composition of capital, as Marx described it, is being squeezed in the direction of more and more technology and fewer workers that you can exploit. That doesn't mean that the overall number of workers is falling globally. the size of the workforce can be rising, but the proportion of investment that is going into wage workers as opposed to technology changes in favor of technology, and the scope for increasing the rate of profit begins to fall. Now, that's one of the features why, as a long-term trend, capitalism goes into deeper and deeper crises. Michael Roberts points out that between 1950 and 2005, the rate of profit in the United States fell by 15%. So we have these features of the capitalist economy that are pushing all the time towards recession and crisis. Those operate with enormous national differences as well. It's inevitable that some countries have higher rates of profit than others, and it is therefore possible for one area of the world to be in crisis before another. Comrades may remember that in the 1990s, Japan's economy was flatlining, while many of the other economies of the world were going through quite significant growth. But what we can see with the uneven and combined development of the world economy is the United States is well past its high point in world domination. It's really been declining as an economic power since the end of the Vietnam War, and it's now seriously unable to compete economically with Asia, particularly with China, falling into economic decline. And with economic decline, ultimately comes military decline as well. So we've had in the West, accompanying this, I mean, it's the decline of certainly of British capitalism as well. And a notable feature has been in British financial markets that British investors have put more and more money into speculative investment. This was something that Marx called fictitious capital. Real capital is based on work, on human labor, on things that have been produced. But increasingly, you'll get things like banks will lend money to home buyers. Those home buyers will be at different degrees of risk as to whether they can repay their loans.
15 minutes, said.
Thanks, Pam. The banks then package all the loans that they've made into deals that can be sold to other banks, and so they're packaging risky mortgages with less risky mortgages. So the package that they're selling to another bank, nobody really knows how much risk is attached to it. And when house prices are rising, the value of all these loans tends to rise as well, because a lot of them are based on the housing market. And so you get these speculative bubbles where banks are buying money off each other. And this is not real investment in productive technology, as Marx explained, was the underlying progressive feature of capitalism. Speculative investment is utterly parasitical, and it's become more and more a feature of particularly the British economy, the American economy as well, since about the 1980s. In 1980, only 5% of US profits came from the financial sector. By 2007, it was 41%. In other words, in the West, in proportion to the shift in world manufacturing going to Asia, the capitalists of the West have more and more become parasitical investors, which of course has contributed enormously to the instability of the global economic system. Just a couple of points in conclusion. In the last 20 years or so, China has been the main source of growth in the world economy. The manufacturing of cheaper goods, because of the scale of production in China, of cheaper and cheaper goods that are being put onto the world market, has cushioned the Western world. Since 2008, most governments in the Western world have been running budget deficits. That is, they've been spending more on, the government has been spending more than it's been receiving in taxation, which is, in capitalist terms, it's a formula for inflation. And the only thing that's protected the world from very widespread inflation in that last decade and a half has been the fact that China has been putting huge amount of very, very cheap goods onto the world market, which has helped keep prices down. Things are changing in the Chinese economy now. First of all, the disease of property speculation has crept into China. You have the Evergrande crisis that comrades may have read about, where a very, very big Chinese real estate developer has gone into financial trouble because of speculative loans that can't be repaid. And that poses the question of whether the Chinese government will step in to take some measures to nationalize parts of Evergrande. If it does, because investment is international these days, there are Western companies who've invested in Evergrande who may lose some of their assets. So there'll be repercussions on Western capitalist stock markets as well. And the world looks as if it's on the, I mean, we've already heard people talking about the special economic downturn and crisis that was produced by the beginning part of the COVID pandemic, where production collapsed so much in the Western world. But now we have the prospect of a much wider scale economic crisis based on speculative markets in China collapsing. So the conclusion: capitalism is not a success story. GDP per capita has been declining globally in 1 country out of 3, and levels of inequality between countries and within countries are rising rapidly. 80% of the world's population get no benefit at all, even when capitalism is booming. And the rivalry over world markets is the underlying impetus to war. The reason that the rich are getting richer is not that they work harder, nor that they are cleverer. The fundamental reason that the rich are getting richer is they start off with more assets. The enormous task of dealing with the climate emergency is something that requires massive infrastructure projects that are planned at governmental and international level. It's not the kind of problem that can be solved, as Boris Johnson imagines, with another frantic boom with everyone buying electric cars. It takes far more in terms of development of infrastructure, alternative fuels, and so on, than any capitalist politician can imagine. I hope I've whetted the appetite of comrades to read a bit more deeply about Marxist economics, because many comrades, and I quite respect the comrades for this reason, many comrades join the movement just because they see that society is unfair. They want a fairer society. But if we can understand in depth why society is unfair, and understand the laws of motion of why capitalism doesn't work, why capitalism is doomed to dig its own grave, why each crisis of capitalism will tend to be more severe than the preceding one, why ultimately capitalism cannot offer a future to the people of the planet. If we understand this, then we are in a better position as activists to argue our case for a world in which resources are planned and dealt with in an equitable way, so that all of humanity can benefit from the science and technology that capitalism has developed.
Thanks very much, Ed. I think that's an absolutely excellent introduction. I'm going to throw the debate open to comments and contributions now. If comrades want to come in, could you possibly use your electronic hands? And I'm going to ask if you can keep your comments to 5 minutes in the first instance, and then if everybody's had a chance to speak, we could go around again. So I'm waiting for a hand to go up now. Andrew.
Yes, I am. Yeah. Hello, everyone. It's Andy Ford here from Warrington. It's a question for Ed. Why does the tendency of the rate of profit to fall result in capitalist crisis it's got a regularity, hasn't it? Every 5, 6, 7 years. What makes that happen? Never quite got that, and I'm not sure that Mark explains it either. So if you know the answer, I'd be very glad. Thank you.
Do you want to respond to that, Ed, or shall we just have a few contributions first?
Can I make a very brief response to Andrew? I don't know in detail why the cyclical character of capitalism, it seems to me, fundamentally comes from recurrent crises of overproduction. The tendency of the rate of profit to fall is a longer term trend that contributes, aggravates each successive crisis. I mean, there are debates about why capitalist crises come so regularly, and I don't claim to know the answer to all the issues in those debates. I'll leave it at that for the moment, Pam.
Okay, thanks, Ed. I'm sure somebody will come back on that at some point. So can I take Temos next, please?
Yes, I would like to thank Ed for a very clear and accurate presentation of Marx's approach to capitalism and how it works. And I think that I don't have much to add there. One thing that I think we should concentrate on, though, is what's happening today. And it seems to me that capitalism really exhausted itself. And we don't have really the situation that Marx was describing. Monopolies have become so huge and so important and so all-controlling, both on the economy and politics, and nationally within countries and worldwide, that things are changing, and they are changing not towards socialism as we all imagine, but towards the control of individuals who really plunder the wealth of the planet, not in just appropriating surplus value under normal production, but as Ed mentioned, through financial trickery, through all sorts of things that do not have nothing to do with capitalism. It doesn't mean that capitalism is not here anymore. I mean, the vast majority of capitalists still work under the same rules that I described. But the important piece of capitalism today, the monopolies, the international monopolies, are a different matter, and they are controlling the game. Now, how far can this go? I don't think that is a stable situation. We have reached a point where there is a different system of production, it's a different working of capitalism. And I'm not saying this myself. I mean, Lenin realized that, and he described it quite well in Imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, where he mentioned that monopolies and monopoly capitalism and imperialism is not, it grew out of free competition, and it's a higher order of economic system. And I think we are living through a period that was described by Lenin, but on a much higher level, and on an international scale. And I think that's what we'll have to fight for. I mean, we should avoid criticizing the monopolies and say that competition is right or anything. Just appropriate the monopolies. That's the point. And what we should be fighting for is exactly how to take over these huge structures that they have been placed there for us by capitalism itself. We don't have to do anything but take them from the hands from private ownership and take it into social ownership. That's all we have to do now, and I think that makes the whole economic transition easy. The political thing is the big question, and that's where we have to see how we can organize to achieve this. Thank you.
Thanks, Tomos. Arman, you're next.
Hi there. It's just a very, very brief thing. Thanks. It was very clear. I just wanted to add one thing. The question was asked about the idea of the crisis. Generally, crisis is known as when the profit compared to the capital that is put in, if that as a rate is going downwards, and if it becomes absolute, we call it a crisis. That's the reason. The question is why Marx does not refer to it as a continuous crisis, but an issue which has a tendency to fall of the rate of profit. And that tendency is the whole idea where Marxism is actually much clear about the role of the working class, about the impact of it in terms of the changes, about the competition between the different variety of sources of capital, and the fact that they actually overtake one another through the crisis by actually achieving, through those who have gone bankrupt, a cheaper version of the means of capital on one hand, and at the same time, the degree by which they can exploit the working class. So whenever we talk about the fall in the rate of profit, when that tendency becomes absolute, that's the time where, on one hand, we see extensive competition growing between the capitalists, like what we saw in the world wars, on one hand, but at the same time, it is a time where the working class could also change the scenario by actually not making its labor cheaper. So that it has got both aspects of the work. But what I think could be added to what Ed was saying is that what Marx does through the explanation of the issues of capital, what has consistently over the past 100, 150 years has become paramount to everybody, and all the capitalists also agree with that it is what Marx said is actually being recognized. But what is the case, which is important, is what Marx, or the emphasis that Marx puts on the gravedigger that Ed mentioned, about the class that can actually make the change in the situation. And the idea of the human beings not being doomed and destined, but they are the ones who can actually make the change themselves, is the whole issue of what Marx, or what is called as a practical human being. The fact that people, working class, can actually end this system. And the way it will end this system would be ended by end to the private property. It would end it by actually getting rid of the idea of production for the profit. And that is the whole idea behind the working class and its ability. It's not because we glamorize working class because they're good, or because we feel as if as part of the working class, we are important and we can do this. But what Marx does show is the reason why the working class, as the only class who does not have any benefit in the production for the purpose of profit, is the only one who can actually do it, unlike the serfs, the slaves, etc. And from that point of view, I think Marx's addition in terms of recognizing and its application today is ever so much evident and clear. Thanks.
Thanks, man. Right, Bob Archer, you're next. Oh, yeah.
Hello, comrades. Thanks very much. And thanks to Ed for starting off what is an extremely important discussion and study that should go on, I think, should be continued, and all comrades should contribute to. I just want to make a couple of points. Marx entered the analysis of capitalism at a point when thinkers like Adam Smith and David Ricardo had already identified labor as the source of profit, but they had been labor as a source of value, but they had been completely unable to explain how the thing worked. They'd not been able to identify that what the worker sells to the employer in the way that was explained is the potential ability to work. That's the commodity. Labor is a human process, an eternally necessary human activity, as Marx described it somewhat earlier. And Marx's real contribution was to really analyze what value is and distinguish between exchange value and use value and all those very difficult matters with which he started Volume 1 of Capital. I think these are important things for comrades to grapple with because they lead up to then the chance of understanding money, which is another huge question, and I think it's important. I just want to make a few other points if I've got time. This question of China, it's becoming clearer and clearer to me that what happened in 1971 was already the crisis of imperialism was taking quite difficult forms for particularly for the Americans who were in charge of the whole show. And they were facing big class struggles at home. We'd had a series of powerful class struggles. Most of the comrades in this chat will have gone through the 1960s, 70s and 80s in England and Britain. We know there were massive class struggles, which were to do with the decline of Britain as a great imperial power. And attempts from the ruling class to deal with that had failed. What the Chinese leadership did was to throw a lifeline to Nixon in America and to the ruling class in Britain. Actually, it was Thatcher who picked that one up at the end of the 70s by offering that if trade was opened between China and the West, if the boycott was lifted, and it was a terrible boycott, and obviously it's the right of the Chinese people to trade with the world, but if that was lifted, he would provide cheap Chinese labor to completely undercut and destroy the labor movement in Britain and America and across Europe. And I think when we're trying now to understand where China's at, we have to understand that very that awful and great betrayal of the working class, because the boom was what kept capitalism going was the cheap labor of Chinese workers, and it completely undercut, of course, the industries that we know in the Rust Belt in America and in the industrial areas of Britain. So I think that's a point worth making and developing. I strongly agree with Themos. If you're going to talk about updating this understanding of the crisis, you have to start with Lenin. You have to start with Lenin. You have to start with Lenin, because he understood that all the economic developments were the material form taken by class struggle. It's the developments in economy and in finance and so forth are driven by the struggle between the classes. And it was that short book by Lenin is very important on that matter. I'd also like to push a book which goes into the material, which goes into the material history of the period since the Second World War. It's Balazs Nagy, Marxist Considerations on the Crisis, which is fortunately available on Marxist Internet Archive. Final point, what arises, what comrades have been driving at and not actually said is, it's the crisis for the working class is a crisis of leadership. That we have to resolve this crisis of leadership, but that's not just jumping on a soapbox and waving a banner we have to think how, in practice, in policies, in work with the working class, we resolve this crisis. And that's a much harder one than I think most of us have appreciated in our lifetime. Sorry, somebody's asked what's the name of the book. I'll put it in the chat if that's all right. And
That's fine,
thanks,
yeah,
comrades.
Right, thanks, Bob. David Hempson.
Yeah, many thanks to Ed, for a very concise introduction and bringing out the main elements, in Marx thinking, and the theory, the Marxist theory of a capitalist economy. I think we have to have a number of elements in mind, though, when we look at the actual economy as we see it today. The first element is the exploitation of nature and the turning of natural products into products, commodities, as Marx described. In the next 20 years, we could be seeing whether we are moving from capitalist type crises to total environmental crises. In other words, whether nature is going to take its revenge and wreck whole countries, as is beginning in many countries, such as even the United States, where we have tornadoes of over 200 miles an hour, completely devastating whole cities. And riding for 240 miles of destruction. And this is all produced by the results of capitalism. In other words, we have to have all the components of Marx's theory in mind, as well as the outcomes that we see now. That's first of all nature. The second question I want to raise is the question of international markets. Bob has mentioned, the Chinese participation on the world market is unprecedented and has actually shored up capitalism without a doubt, and has caused misery to workers in the West. At the same time, it's redistributed wealth to the Chinese people in a way which is completely unprecedented in any capitalist economy. Ted Grant always mentioned the progressive nature of the widening markets worldwide. In other words, if capitalism could maintain its expansion of world markets, it had something progressive. The progressive nature was the building of an international working class, which Roger has mentioned time and again, is expanding in an unprecedented manner and is giving us the opportunity to be able to create a sounding board and the instrument to end the capitalist system. But we have to keep that in mind all the time. My last point is in relation to inequality. I made a study of dock workers in Durban, and in 1880, those workers earned 2 shillings and 6pence. It's hard to think of what it is today in today's economy. But that was more than the London docker at that time. Durban, a colonial outpost, had workers who were earning more than in London. Now, those workers in South Africa earn maybe a fifth or maybe 20% of the workers. There are no longer any dockers in London, I don't think, but the dockers in Liverpool, in San Francisco, or anywhere else in the advanced capitalist country. The inequality that is accelerating at the moment is quite unprecedented in worldwide. And we are seeing, for instance, in Lebanon, 93% of the people now living in abject poverty, not just a little bit poor, but actually unable to feed their families. In Lebanon, which is a country which was previously of middle-term capitalist development, and we're approaching the same in South Africa. In South Africa, we have 40% unemployment. In Britain, it's 4%. In America, it's 3.8%. These are phenomenal inequalities which capitalism is developing, and unfortunately, workers are trapped by the national state and unable at this stage to see at any scale the necessity for internationalism to end this iniquitous system once and for all. Thank you.
Thanks very much, David. Adam?
Hello, I was just wondering, Ed mentioned the issue with fictitious capital, and I assume he meant stuff like CDOs in the housing market. I was just wondering how much he thought Marx applied in a post-1971 world where essentially all capital is fictitious, backed by governments, and whether he sees cryptocurrencies as an evolution of capitalism.
Okay, thanks, Adam. I can't see any other hands up at the moment, so I don't know if Ed would like, as you've just asked Ed a question, if you'd like to take this opportunity to respond to that and to anything else that comrades have raised, Ed.
So the question is how do we see cryptocurrency in the context of fictitious capital?
Sorry, that wasn't quite my question.
Please
clarify. More so, my question was, you mentioned the issue with fictitious capital when they essentially package up debt, sell it to each other, and then that kind of just causes a whole mess. But all capital is essentially fictitious. If, like, take the bailout, each crisis that there's been recently, it gets resolved quicker and quicker because capitalists can never lose out, and the stock market immediately gets bailed out. The stock market hasn't spent more than, I can't remember off the top of my head how many days it hasn't gone up, but it just keeps going up because there's constant quantitative easing and pumping in of stimulus from government.
But we've lost your sound, Adam. We've lost your sound.
I think he stopped speaking, hasn't he?
No, he hasn't. I don't think.
Had you finished, Adam?
No, I hadn't. My headphones died.
Yeah, we did lose your sound then. We've got it back now.
Do you recall where I left off?
Well, you said you got to the point where you were saying all capital is fictitious.
All capital is fictitious in the sense that if it can be printed to bail people out, then it's just printed at will. It's not backed by any sort of value. It's just given out, and it just puts a band-aid on the problem at that present moment, and it just keeps building up. And every time there's a crash, it just the same thing happens again. So there's never really any unrest in the working classes, because if there is a problem, like everybody getting furloughed, everybody got fictitious cash put into their bank accounts and they could keep paying for bills. So there can never be any sort of unrest because they can always solve that problem by just depositing money into your account, fictitious or otherwise. And my cryptocurrency question was a second question to say, do you think capitalism is evolving into something different?
Right. Well, let's first of all just talk a little bit about this idea of fictitious capital and money being pumped into the economy by the banks. It's okay for money to be pumped into the economy by the banks, as with furlough and so on, provided there are goods and services to back up that money. If a government just pumps money into the economy and there's no corresponding improvement in the production of the things that people need, rather than solve any problems, it in theory will lead to inflation, which is why I made the point that, you know, over the last couple of decades, what's bailed out Western governments with their pumping money into the economy has been the counter-inflationary effect of China putting cheaper and cheaper goods onto the world market. If there are goods for people to buy with the government, with the money that the government is pumping out, then you're right, Adam, that people can be kept happy for a while through these government stratagems. The problem arises, and this was the case in Germany in 1923, when you have a huge increase in the money supply and no corresponding increase in the amount of goods and services that are available. Then instead of having some sort of stability, you actually have a spiraling of inflation and a massive economic crisis with all the social discontent that goes with it. I don't agree, Adam, with your with the idea that all capital is fictitious.
I'm sorry.
This is a very, sorry, Adam, please come back if you want to just
Yeah,
respond.
just let Ed finish with the
I'll let
Adam.
you finish, sorry.
Okay, well, no, I mean, you see, capital is fictitious if it is only a government pumping out money, or if it is a banker or banks making money by the rising value of paper assets, such as a package of debts, or where house prices are inflating simply because there are not enough houses and prices are going up and up and up. That you can call all of that fictitious but capital itself. And this is the enormous value of Marx as a sort of a starting point for our understanding of capital itself is created by human labor. Real capital is assets, right? So we're talking about the capital of all the productive capacity of a factory, or the productive capacity of the food production industry. That these things feed people, they clothe people, they provide people with the things they need, houses and so on. So capital only becomes fictitious when it parts company with the real assets in the real world of human need, and begins to take on sort of inflationary characteristics through banks buying and selling it, or governments inflating its price through pumping money into the economy. I've got to say, on cryptocurrency, thank you very much for the question, and I don't really know the answer. I would very much welcome if other comrades in this meeting could put some ideas in about crypto. I've thought about it a lot. I've argued with one of my sons about it a lot. I personally don't see how cryptocurrency, well, if anyone makes money out of cryptocurrency, it must be speculative. There's no real work goes into the production of cryptocurrency. It must be based on speculation. And I assume that cryptocurrency takes a similar role in the economy to other currencies. In other words, people buy it if they think it can be a useful asset and sell it if it isn't. But beyond that, I'm willing to learn some more about the role of cryptocurrency if any comrades want to comment on it.
Okay, thanks, Ed. I think, I don't know whether Adam's got any more questions for perhaps a little while, but Bob Archer's had his head up for a bit. So if we can have Bob next, and if you think of something later you want to ask Adam, then do put your hand up. Okay, Bob Archer.
On that very good question from Adam, which I'm glad to see he won't let go of. That's good. No, it takes us to very important things, doesn't it? 1971, at that point, the American state was the only state which maintained a currency that was backed by gold. And by agreement, all the other capitalist states valued their currency in relation to the dollar. And the value of the dollar was based on the value of an ounce of fine gold, or a certain number of ounces of fine gold. Now, the way that the pressure on the American economy revealed itself was that there were a lot of dollars floating around Europe, the euro dollar. And by the way, it was the Russians who invented the euro dollar and developed the euro dollar market. So there are a lot of American dollars floating around Europe, and there were a lot of Europeans turning up at the Federal Reserve Bank with a large pile of dollars saying, we want to buy gold at this rate. And that was how the crisis actually made itself felt in finance, that they were running out of gold. And people were taking away gold in carrier bags and selling it for much more than they'd paid for it. So that was at that point. And I remember the moment well, hearing the announcement on the radio 1 o'clock in the morning, one morning in 1971, that they severed the link between the dollar and gold. Now, that got over a problem for a while, and it meant that money was now fiat money, which is what comrades have been talking about. But it means that aspects of the crisis become much less able to be controlled. Yes, they can. I mean, inflation has actually continued, and it's quite. It's become quite uncontrollable. I think it will become even more uncontrollable. Ed is right on that point. That for several reasons, after Brexit and after, given the economic crisis, there will be very severe inflation, certainly here. But we've had this experience of quantitative easing, which is a bit different. They've given money, basically, they've bought financial instruments off a very small handful of privileged dealers in order to save the banking system from going completely under, as it did in 1929. So quantitative easing isn't quite the same as spraying money around, but it comes very close to it. And I think it edged closer and closer to it as time went on. So it's a real problem. The problem is, what is the bloody money worth? What can you buy with it? And the answer is less and less. So I think it's a really fruitful. But again, last point, one of the great things about Marx is he grappled with the concept of what is value. So what is the value of money? It's understanding those as social, as the outcome of social processes. That's perhaps a very important way to go.
Okay, thanks, Bob. Right, we've got John or Dominic wanting to come in next. Could you go in now, please?
Yeah, sorry, I'm having trouble with this machine. Unfortunately, I missed virtually the whole of the introduction. So I'm just want to raise a few points on what's been said. I think with regard to, I mean, just on the last point, it was de Gaulle, to my memory, who came in on this question of the gold standard that America was using, which I think was set up at Bretton Woods at $35 an ounce. And France was being flooded, firms were being bought up and all the rest of it. So de Gaulle got fed up with it and said, all right, there's X amount of dollars, I want Y amount of gold back. And that sort of blew the whole thing wide open. So that was, to my memory, about that. I think point that was made by a comrade about furlough and it's, you know, keeping things going. I mean, the reality is that the bill for furlough has not been presented yet. And when that's presented, it will be really serious as far as cuts, because the working class will be told to pay that. And even in the most vicious situations where they've just done national insurance instead of tax rates, because that affects the lower paid, it affects the working class far more than it affects the capitalists and all their hangers on. And a thing that's getting to me is talk of inflation. And I think what we should be talking about is devaluation, because the currency has been devalued. That's what's going on. And it's a permanent fixture. The government set a target in Britain of a 2% devaluation year on year. So the currency has been devalued year on year. The amount of value that's been produced by the working class can't be consumed at the same rate as it was. And it's coming back to question of crisis. One of the basic things I understood, and I've not got a very brilliant understanding of Marxism, but was a whole thing that the working class can't consume the value of the wealth it produces. The capitalists take a portion, a fraction of the wealth the worker produces, whether that's half, 3/4 or a quarter or whatever. But the value of the goods produced can't be consumed by the workers. So what do the workers, so what do the capitalists do? They don't balance the system by either creating new products, better situations as far as housing and all the other things in society, spending it on that, which is creating more value. They just go flooding round, speculating, whatever it was railways, it was radio, it was computers, tech systems and all that, GC went bust. Major engineering firm I used to work for went bust, and that was a firm when I was working there that had over £1 billion in the bank. And for an engineering firm, that was absolutely astonishing, because most engineering firms were in debt to the banks. They weren't, you know, so that was a situation. It employed, I think, 300,000 workers worldwide. They got a new managing director in, and he started paying cash for all sorts of innovations in technology that turned out to be pipe dreams. So the whole thing collapsed, and the banks made a killing on it, and what was left was split up. But the whole thing to me is the crisis in capitalism. One of the fundamental reasons for it is the fact that the workers can't consume what they produce. So you get overproduction, unable to be consumed by the working class, and therefore, you know, you've got the inbuilt thing of a crisis. I mean, the capitalists will flood into housing, or flood into all sorts of different things, because there's no plan. There's no planned economy, and the crisis of capitalism can only be solved by a planned economy, and that comes back to the role of the working class. And I think, as Marx put it, every society produces the seeds of its own destruction. Capitalism produced the working class, and the working class is the seeds of the production of the destruction, proceeds of the destruction of the capitalist class. So I'm sorry I missed all this thing. I don't know if everybody else got cut out at the start, but we certainly did.
Okay, thanks, Dominic. No other hands up at the moment. Anybody else want to come in? Anybody wants to ask anything? You don't have to speak for 5 minutes if you don't want to. Adam, if you put your, oh, just a sec. Right, I don't know who was first, Andrew and Adam. Let's have Andrew in next, I think, because he spoke earlier in the discussion. Andrew, do you want to go ahead, please?
Yeah, it's just to talk about this question of quantitative easing. I think Radio 4 had a programme about quantitative easing. They gave a figure of £450 billion created by Rishi Sunak. That's not quantitative easing. That was on the pandemic, actually. A lot more than that's been created in QE. And remember, Corbyn got, you know, attacked massively for promising to borrow 15 billion, and Sunak got away with 450 billion. And you know, as one of the other comrades said, that money will have to be paid back. I think the financial instrument's been created, and so this huge overhang of debt is probably similar to the Second World War or something, but it's not so fictitious that it'll never be paid back. It's fictitious as it's created, but once it's created, people have got assets, you know, the elite have got assets tied up in it. Also, QE has massively increased inequality, hasn't it? Because the whole thing is to maintain the value of stock markets. The owners of stocks, they've seen their incomes stabilize, and not their income, their wealth stabilize and rise, whereas other people are struggling. So it creates all this money, but it only flows the top 0.1%. It's very interesting. It's worth it analysing, because I'm not sure that any of the great Marxists ever had to deal with something like this.
Okay, thanks, Andrew. Adam, do you want to come back in now? You have to unmute yourself.
There we go. Okay, I think a better encapsulation of what I was trying to say is Ed and Marxists since Marx have mentioned the tendency of rate of profit to fall. Who's not making profit? Profits have been insane this year because of the capital being pumped into the people's pockets that lost out, which was my point. It doesn't really need an answer. That was just a better conceptualization of what I was trying to say. That's it.
Okay, thanks, Adam. Larry.
Yeah, thanks very much, Pam, Chair. One question I'd like to ask, Rob, is that earlier in the pandemic, there was a an article I read that the government issued bonds to the value of £300 billion. Now, at that time, I think I watched another program which said that the interest or the value of those could be earned of 4%. Now, I've always had a doubt as to whether in actual fact we have a debt because of the issuing of these bonds, because somebody must be taking the bonds out at 4%, and the government must have sold them through the Bank of England for a percentage. And therefore, the question of the £300 billion that is being justified as a debt, in actual fact, the government earned on it, I would assume. So if there can be any more clarification from some of the comrades on that point. Thank you.
Thanks, Larry. I'm sure there'll be somebody that wants to come back in on that. Otherwise, I hand it back to Ed again.
Well,
nobody else? No.
Could I just ask Larry to clarify that question? So, Larry, I mean, I don't. So you're talking about debt.
No, what I'm saying is that the government, and it wasn't widely spread as information. I just happened to pick it up from somewhere. I can't remember where the source was, but the government at the start of the pandemic issued government bonds to the value of £300 billion through the Bank of England on a speculative market. Now, if I assume that selling bonds, you get some income from it, and certainly the people that buy the bonds are expecting an income from it. And why I'm saying is because from that point on, everybody, you know, including the mass media, was saying about the debt that's going to be incurred by this country through the pandemic is going to be paid back by the working class. And it didn't balance well with my thinking that the bonds and issuing of bonds, as they did in the both world wars, were an investment in the future of this country by capitalists. Does that clarify it for you, Ed?
Yeah. I mean, I think the point about issuing bonds is it's okay issuing bonds. That as long as the money that comes in from issuing them is put to some productive use, and there's it seems to me that the problem in the British economy at the moment is that there's no serious attempt by the government to invest in industrial production that would improve both the well-being of the people in this country and contribute sort of capital assets to the future of humanity. I mean, there's scope for doing it. I mean, you're talking about, say, a massive program of investment in green energy along the lines that Jeremy Corbyn was talking about with Labour's Green New Deal. You know, you're talking about solar panels, wind turbines, harnessing the energy of the sea and so on to produce alternative forms of power that would actually effectively, once the investment is made on those kind of projects, eventually the return you get is so great that the price that you could charge for energy would virtually disappear to zero. I mean, if for example, if you're getting energy from the tide, from the tides in the oceans, the only cost is the maintenance of the equipment. There's actually no, you know, it's not like coal mining or oil mining where you have to drill down deep and people have to take risks and all kinds of filth. And once a tidal barrage or a dam is made that captures the power of water, or wind turbines with the you only need maintenance costs. And the problem for capitalist investors is, if you have an investment which may be very, very expensive in the first place, but eventually it yields a benefit for humanity for which the price you can charge tends towards zero, there is absolutely no profit on it. So capitalists explain that. They don't explain it in the way I've explained it. They explain it from the point of view, oh, we can't do it because the investment costs are too great. But what they mean is the investment costs are so great in return for what we'll get back. And this is a long-term consequence of the process I described when I was talking about volume 3 of Capital, of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. You're talking about such a big investment in technology with so little human labor involved in the final outcome that there is virtually no tangible profit for the capitalist. And of course, from the point of view of looking at society as a socialist, this can lead to a decline in the amount of work that all humans have to do, which would release humanity for creative leisure time, to the point where there comes a point in a future socialist society where there is no formal distinction between work and recreation, because all work becomes so creative that people simply do it because they enjoy doing it. So the idea of, digging down deep into the bowels of the earth to get coal and so on, all of that becomes a thing of the past. Now, humanity is on the edge of being able to run society in these ways. But the barrier to it is that the billionaires who still control our society, who control the political influences in our society, that control the economic pressures in our society, they can't see a way through that, because it doesn't represent for them a way of them continuing to make profit. I'm just looking at, Pam, am I summing up, or am I just commenting on some of the things that have been said?
Well, there's 3 hands up at the moment, so I was going to suggest that perhaps you could leave it there.
Okay, I'll leave it there.
And then come back to it later. I'm going to invite Felicity next because she's not spoken yet. And then Bob Archer, followed by David Hempson. So Felicity, would you like to go ahead?
Thank you. I want to speak just on the issue that Larry raised about the issuing of bonds, and whether the issuing of bonds will lead to a big government debt or a big national debt. And I think that goes to one of the most important lies that the capitalists have been able to put over on us in the last 20 years. And that's the lie of austerity. There was no need for austerity. Austerity did not help sort the crisis, the banking crisis out, and the crisis based on dealings in fictitious capital. But they managed to convince everybody that the country had to run its economy like a household budget, and that if you're in debt, you're in serious trouble. So yes, they did issue bonds. They issued a lot of bonds at the start of the pandemic, and they're still in the market. It's part of quantitative easing, and quantitative easing is intended to, as Ed explained, keep money moving around the market, keep people spending, keep people investing. Failed dramatically in keeping people investing, and the richest people got at least £100,000 personally in their bank accounts as a result of quantitative easing. It was a disgraceful exercise. modern monetary theory, which I don't espouse, but which is very popular in the movement at the moment, would say that governments can just spend endlessly because they create the money. But I think, as Ed mentioned, there has to be a link between the basic wealth of the country, and that's infrastructure and industry. That has to relate to money somewhere along the line to prevent inflation. Michael Roberts writes very well about all of that in The Next Recession. So it's worth having a look at that. But just basically, Larry, you're quite right. It's a lie. We don't need austerity. We will not have to repay that debt, but they will force it on us. And we've got to convince our people that it is a lie. Austerity was a lie, and there is no need for another round of austerity, which Rishi, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, is heading for, shortly. We've got to really expose that lie of austerity. Thank you.
Thanks, Felicity. Right, so Bob, do you want to come back in now? Don't forget to unmute yourself.
Yeah. Just to explain what happens when governments issue bonds. Investors turn up and pay the face value of the bond, and the government then has that money to play around with, do what it wants. And then the bond probably gets bought and sold, and it's an object of speculation itself. But it has at the end of its due period, the owner of the bond brings it back to the government and says, give us our money. You redeem a bond, it's a loan. And furthermore, the government is paying interest on it all the way through as well. So it's not that, basically, they issue bonds in order to have cash to use for the for current expenditure, but they have to pay them back. And then they will of course come the poor mouth and come back and ask us for it. They'll say that, as Felicity explained, they'll then use that as an excuse to close another hospital or to and so forth. Point to note, what they do in the finance system reflects the state of the class struggle. When you have a strong working class, I mean, Labour government, 1945, had to make a big loan, had to borrow a load of money off America. The Americans were very glad to give it because it enabled them to keep the British working class away from revolution. The class struggle is reflected in the finance system. And if I think we will find that the view that you can issue as many bonds as you like, put as much money as you want out there, that will very quickly turn around, I think, depending on political developments. But I think we'll get a Tory, you'll get the ruling class saying we want it all back, basically.
Yeah, that would doubt.
They'll try.
Okay. Thank you, Bob. That's it. Yeah. Okay, David Hempson.
Thanks for your points there, Bob. And I just heard an interesting piece a while ago on the role of money, and it mentioned, I think, that something like 50 years ago, the average house in Britain was £500. And now the average has moved up to something like £500,000. In other words, inflation is built into capitalism. It's the expectation that prices will rise, leads to investment, and then the idea of increased profits. I mean, the massive profits. I accept that we will see a long-term decline in the rate of profit, but capitalists don't always see that. They see the immediate future. and one sector goes down, another sector goes up. If you go back to the companies of 100 years ago, you won't see a single company which has lasted all that time. They come and go. There's a continuous construction and destruction of companies. It's turmoil out there if you look at it over the long term. In the short term, it seems fairly stable, but it's not. It's eating itself up. Now, I just want to mention that, but the idea of time and of term is very important. And I want to raise this point in relation to maybe an over concentration on the idea of recession. You know, someone made a joke and said that Marxists have predicted the past 30 recessions, which happened 5 times. In other words, we can become fixated by the idea that once recession happens, then the working class will wake up and we'll realize that we're being exploited. But actually, it never works quite that way, because even in recessions, we can have the rise of reaction, not of the rise, well, and revolution, but reaction can also be triumphant for a period. As we see even now, we have deep movements of reaction as well as revolution. I could come and say more about Latin America about that. But I'm a bit concerned if we feel that the only issue, or the prime issue, is the question of recession. In other words, the ups and downs of capitalism. What I see internationally, and I think we should all be aware of, is that the crisis of capitalism is being devolved onto the South, onto the colonial, former colonial world. South Africa is going through hell. Zimbabwe is being cut to pieces. Now, we can't say that our national bourgeois has done the best they can to accelerate the decline. There's no doubt about it. But the fact that we are still in South Africa exporting raw materials to China, to everywhere else in the world, is an indication that we haven't emancipated ourselves from the colonial economy, because the advanced capitalist countries don't want us to manufacture. In a way, what happened in China was they elbowed their way into the world market. They become such a factor. Now it's the engine of the world in the sense of manufacturing, because now they've got all the expertise and they've got relatively cheap labor. South African, well, I won't go into all of our contradictions, but I just want to raise that. The other point is that there's the question of the commodity. I know this goes one step beyond the fetishism of the commodity. I know it goes beyond one step of the, kind of say, the basic elements of capitalist reproduction. But it's astonishing to me in South Africa, everybody is fixated on making money. Beyond belief. Our trade unionists drive around in dark tinted cars with bodyguards. You know, we've really seen, and they're very concerned about showing their flashy watches and so forth. I mean, everyone's bought into this thing. And if they don't have it, then they want it. It's excruciating to me, because it's actually unfortunately true. I wish it weren't. But in other words, the commodity is, even in the colonial world, is something of attraction, and it gives a kind of myth to capitalism. When you see the misery and you can see the despoliation of the land that I knew when I grew up as a boy, you cannot believe it. The junk, the rubbish, the despoliation in every particular way, the value has been taken from nature and destroyed in a way, burned up. I just want to end on the last point on a bit of optimism for socialism, or for the intervention and developing the productive forces. I think that Ed made an excellent point in saying that electricity could be cheap. In fact, it could be free. Can you imagine the horrors that we've had through the development of fossil fuel by the monopolies which have forced fossil fuel down our throats and into our lungs? And actually, there was always an alternative. If you go through history, we'll see there were alternatives all the way. But capital was organized to be able to maintain the digging, the burrowing away, the destruction of nature, to be able to advance. In South Africa, we have all the sun in the world, and we don't even bother to use it. We want to extend fossil fuel, despite the fact that it kills 150,000 people on our interior a year. through cancers and other pulmonary diseases in South Africa. So we have a bright future. We just need to take it. And by the way, last point, sorry, this is the last point. Capitalism is trying to reform. Now we need to think about that. Germany promises, the German regime, the German government promises in 8 years they're going to end all fossil fuel production. They're going to move completely onto another form of production. Now this is astonishing. If it's possible and true, it is an astonishing attempt by capitalism to change itself. And remember that capitalism moves through its own revolutions. It's a change in technology, which is astonishing because markets are not dictating this perfectly. The market for oil is actually quite high currently. But despite this, the capitalist countries are deciding to move away from fossil fuel and move to electricity. I'm not sure of the full dynamics of this, but we need to understand this attempt to reform or to be destroyed. And I think they've become aware that they're moving to such destruction that they have to do something about it. And we need to comment on that too.
Okay, thanks, David. Can't see any other hands up at the moment. I mean, I think myself, Roger's coming in next. I think myself, it just this subject becomes more and more complex. The more twists and turns that capitalism takes to try and keep itself in existence and to keep the world's wealth in the hands of a few. So it is a complex discussion, something I think we all need to read up on and something we need to keep discussing. Because some of it is actually quite hard to understand. But it's really good that people have asked some quite challenging questions that other comrades have responded to. So can I ask Roger to come in next?
Well, I don't want to say anything about the economics. I think it's been, I've learned a lot, and I think the point that David made on the political side. I don't think anybody has argued that recession creates revolution. During a period of slump, then workers are atomized, they're demoralized, they don't have the cohesion because they're scattered into their homes and so on. They're desperate to make a living and so on, and it largely creates demoralization and despair. And any prolonged recession or depression, that is one consequence of that politically. On the other side, booms don't create a revolution in and of themselves either, because it means that workers are working all the hours there are. They have some hope for the future. They have some hope that their children could get a better living standards and all the rest of it. What creates revolution is instability. It's the constant veering from boom to slump and vice versa. If you have a period of prosperity and of economic activity, and then suddenly that's threatened by a slump, then that can galvanize, because the working class are organized, they have the cohesion, and suddenly they're facing a nightmare future for themselves and their children, and they can be motivated, and they have the capacity because they're mobilized and organized in the workplaces, and suddenly they're faced with unimaginable threats. That can be a revolutionizing factor. Also, on the contrary, from the transition from a recession to economic activity, same way, they're lifted suddenly out of the despair, out of the hardship, the poverty and the anxieties, and sometimes of the starvation, which has atomized the solidarity of the working class. And then suddenly the factories are opening, there's opportunities, there's shortages suddenly of labor instead of surpluses and so on. That gives a new impetus to the movement of the working class to change things. So I just wanted to say that, because it was kind of thrown into the discussion. I don't know if maybe I misunderstood David's point on that, but I completely agree with him. It's not a question of either recession or boom creates revolutionizing factors in society. It's the instability, it's the lurch from one from one condition to another, which provides the locomotive, if you like, of revolution.
Okay, thanks, Roger. Right, there's no more hands up at the moment. So it's 25 to 6. There's still time for one or two comments, one or two contributions if anybody wants to make any closing remarks. Otherwise, I'll hand back to Ed to sum up. No? Are we all talked out? Right, okay. Ed,
well,
you want to sum up?
Thank you, Pam, and thank you very much for all the comrades who've contributed, both with very difficult questions and some comrades providing adequate answers and partially answering and contributing great ideas to help clarify those issues. I don't want to sort of go over what's already been said, and I particularly thank Bob Archer, I think, who's certainly helped clarify a lot of questions that I would have found difficult to deal with on my own. It's been a great discussion. Just first of all, to echo the point that Roger has just made, in the 1930s, in the main, the world economy was in decline, and it certainly in Britain and most of Western Europe. It took till the end of the Second World War, till 1945 to 48, for a new revolutionary upsurge to begin to put pressure on society, so that the really important fundamental changes were made, like the introduction of the National Health Service in Britain, because, as comrades have pointed out, because of the threat of revolution. At the same time, in the 1930s, in one or two countries in France, there were revolutions taking place, and this is the point about. I mean, in France and in Spain in the 1930s, there were enormous revolutionary movements. The politics and global politics moves in uneven and combined ways, and there's no doubt that had say the Spanish Revolution been successful, and the workers of Barcelona held power for a while, and organized their own transport systems, their own production processes, their own production of food, and so on. For a while, this was the beginning of workers' democracy. It's a separate discussion to understand why that revolution collapsed. But had they taken power in Spain, then of course the whole atmosphere across the rest of Europe and the rest of the planet would have changed. There would have been a huge new impetus on the part of the working class movement to build on the progress of the Russian Revolution, to build on the achievements of the Spanish workers. And in other words, even in the depths of recession, there can be movements in certain countries that can suddenly change the situation and create revolutionary possibilities globally. And similarly, in movement, in times of great leaps forward, there can be steps back. We're talking about, to use a phrase Ted Grant often used to use, in a period of sudden turns and sharp changes. I just want to go back to this point about the rate of profit, because it's something fundamental that's running through certainly this discussion on economics. The rate of profit in the capitalist economy globally tends to decline as a long-term trend. It doesn't mean that you have to have a falling rate of profit for every recession, but it means over a long period of time, over decades, the tendency of the rate of profit tends to fall, which means that it becomes more and more difficult for capitalists to find areas of investment that are profitable. Of course, some capitalists still do. They still manage to be innovative and so on, but gradually the scope for capitalists to continue to run their own system is diminishing, which is what gives us the courage and the opportunity to advance our program. Now, of course, there's been a big part of this discussion has been the issue of government financing and government issuing of money and so on, producing of money. From a capitalist point of view, all government financing is, the capitalists look at it as a bit parasitical, because all they see it, all government financing must ultimately be paid for by taxation. And taxation for capitalists means that their profits are being taken away from them. So we have to, we have to rethink what we mean by government spending. Government spending is not parasitic. It's investing. It's I mean, we're talking about investing in infrastructure, and the ultimate reason why capitalism is a failed system is because whereas in the early 19th century it did develop productive forces, it did develop science, engineering, invention, it was a source of great creativity. As the 20th century and the 21st century have proceeded, the capitalism has come up against its own barriers. The scale of production is such that in many, many areas of industry, it requires infrastructure to support whatever is being produced in industry. I mean, take for example, modern transportation. It's an absolutely colossally wasteful system. You have millions of people driving around in cars, burning up fossil fuels, causing traffic jams, causing traffic accidents, demanding the widening of roads, more parking places and so on. It's all based on private ownership of vehicles and so on. I don't know if comrades know that at any one time, 90%, what is it? There are, I've got the figure here. There are 1.4 billion cars in the world, and at any given time, 90% of them are parked. I mean, so you've got huge billions of pounds of investment going into making cars and persuading people to buy them, whereas a car sharing scheme, which was organized by computer technology, would reduce by vast amounts, by millions and millions, the number of vehicles that are actually needed on the road. I mean, with computerized engineering, it's possible to have a transport system where you don't need your own car parked outside your house. You press a button and a computer sends a car to you when you need one. And if you're not using it, somebody else can use it. I mean, all of that is possible. But what capitalist car company is going to invest in technology that reduces the demand for cars by 80 or 90%? From the point of view of rational planning of human resources, it cries out as a solution. But from the point of view of the imperative to make profit, it's a non-starter. No capitalist car company is going to make investments of that type, because it's going to reduce, it's going to kill their sales. And so we're in a situation where humanity has reached an end point. We can't continue to go along this road of capitalism. If we do, the long-term future is environmental degradation, and it's no longer a question of capitalism digging its own grave. Capitalism will be digging the grave of humanity. We are at a point where the need for rational planning of the resources of the economy, of the human economy, so that instead of thinking about how do we sell loads and loads of goods for profit in a new capitalist boom, we're thinking about what are the needs of humanity. medical services, sanitation, food supply for those who most need it, housing, infrastructure and communications and transportation for the parts of the world which are neglected, who don't have access to those things. We're talking about big projects that could be undertaken internationally by governments controlled and informed by the democracy of the working class, where the needs of humanity can be catered for through rational planning. This would create creative, skilled jobs that are a pleasure to do, and it would eliminate increasingly all the humdrum, boring jobs that millions of people are still expected to do for long hours and little return. And it's that kind of scenario that our movement must prepare itself to offer humanity as an alternative to the unplanned chaos of an economy that is run by the profit motive.
Thanks, Ed. Although you summed up, I've noticed Temos has got his hands up again. Is there just a brief point you want to make, Temos?
Just 2 or 3 points on the tendency of the rate of profit to fall.
Okay.
I think there are a lot of obscure things that we have to clear up. One, we're not talking about profit in the sense of this law. We're talking about profit like this extracted from the surplus value appropriated by the capitalist. We are not talking about profits made in speculation. We are not talking about profits made from handouts or from swindling one or the other thing. The second thing is that we should not think that if the rate of profit falls, the mass of profit falls as well. Actually, Marx said that you usually have the rate of profit falling while the mass of profit increasing. And there was an interesting statistic when they were discussing about taxing the profits of the big companies. And it turned out that Amazon's profits were much below the level of profit that would be taxed anyway. So you have there a very specific case where a very low rate of profit is producing a huge amount of mass of profit. So again, this should be borne in mind. And also, we have today the obscene situation where profits are being given directly by government handouts to these big companies.
Thanks, Temos. We have actually already had the summing up, and we've got hands going up in future. Appreciate if you could just bob your hands up before we have the summing up. But Steve Zeltzer, you could have 2 minutes for a quickie.
Yeah, I mean, I think, sorry I came in late to this, but one of the things that is happening in capitalism, and of course, financial speculation, cryptocurrency, the capitalist, and not having a value in their currency. So that is creating a crisis in itself. The speculation that's going on globally and is undermining their whole financial structure of capitalism. But the other thing is, I think the massive profits that capitalists are making in this pandemic. During this pandemic, the massive amounts of profits have gone up tremendously with Bezos and the capitalist class, which is showing the contradictions of capitalism and exposing to the working class a system that, while they're dying from COVID, the capitalists are doing very well. And the defense of their profits by the capitalist politicians around the world. They defend the right to make profits off this pandemic, which is a very sharp thing. The other thing is, I think we have to talk about with capitalism and the crisis of capitalism is the rise of fascism. Because fascism and war is no solution to the economic contradictions of capitalism. However, the rise of fascism and the acceptance of this crisis, as that is the way it is important to confront. Because in the United States, the fascists are saying you have to accept the COVID crisis. You have to accept the conditions in the school. In fact, you should go and die in the schools. And this is creating a massive explosion in the working class. The New York Times today just has a front page article. Maybe the labor crisis in the schools may tear apart everything. In other words, labor peace is no longer possible because of the effort to drive workers back to their desks in the schools. So this is going to create the crisis of capitalism, and the drive to make the working class pay for it is going to actually politicize and radicalize the working class. And the central question, again, is the working class party, whether the working class can organize itself politically to confront this. But the conditions for a real development, a political development, are growing massively. And there's a political vacuum which only the working class can really fill. And that's why I think internationalism, building an international working class movement is critical on a global level.
Okay, thanks, Steve. I think that's the last comment of the debate now. So I was going to say, you know, we're talking about making profit from the pandemic. An absolute fortune's been made out of hand sanitizers and disinfectants. So now they're actually now starting to say they've had very little effect at all in fighting COVID, which is crazy. Anyway, I think we'll call that the end of the discussion. It's been a really good discussion. Thanks, Ed, for leading off, and thanks for everybody for your contributions. It's obviously a subject we have to return to again and again, because this is absolutely fundamental in the fight for socialism, that we understand this and that we're able to convince other people, really. So I'll call that the end of the discussion. Roger, do you want to come in about next week's meeting?
Right, it's not actually finalised, but we're trying to get an expert on the worldwide health crisis and all the issues arising from that. Obviously, a notice will go out as soon as we've secured the speaker. I'd also like to draw attention to British comrades for to a meeting on Tuesday. It's hosted by Newham Socialist Labour. It's a meeting for Labour Party members, ex-members, expelled members, etc., around the country. I'm actually, in the last few days, we've been flooded with inquiries from groups of comrades in different constituencies in Britain who are interested to know more about what Newham is doing, and are taking up similar kind of steps themselves in order to develop really the developing split in the Labour Party, which is taking place now. I mean, I don't want to speak about the issue except to say that we know that from the Corbyn years, the Labour Party was the biggest party in Europe, the biggest political party in Europe. Now, most of the people who surged into the party during that time have either left or been kicked out or are inactive anymore. And potentially, in other words, with the split that's developing, potentially the left, the socialist wing of the Labour Party, could become once again the biggest party in the country, or the biggest country in Europe. And I think this is a crucial period when time will tell whether or not the left can mobilize or organize itself properly or not. So I think this meeting on Tuesday would be quite important. So I'm just kind of reminding, I see that some of the British comrades have left the meeting now, but can we all publicise that and make sure that we get a full attendance?
Roger, is it worth mentioning the meeting on Friday, the Lien Leo meeting? Because we need comrades to sign up for that, don't we? Because 3 people in this meeting are standing for the steering committee of that organisation. Well,
yes, that's. I don't want to go into too much detail because most of the comrades here are not from Britain. But there is a all members meeting of the newly merged left opposition, if you like, in the Labour Party. And if anybody wants more details, can they get in touch by email or whatever?
Okay, thanks, Roger. Right, so I think that's the end of the meeting now. I'd like to thank you all for your attendance. See you next week, hopefully at the same time. Bye for now.